On the afternoon of July 7th, 2024, a thermometer at Harry Reid International Airport in Las Vegas read 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That number is not remarkable because it is high. In a desert city in July, high is the baseline. It is remarkable because of what it replaced. The record it broke was 117 degrees. That record had stood since 1942. It had been matched 5 separate times across 82 years, in 1942, in 2005, in 2013, in 2017, and in 2021, and in all that time, not one of those days had managed to push past it by even a single degree. Then, in one afternoon, it fell by 3. That is not how temperature records break. Records that old normally give way by 1/10 of a degree, by a rounding error, by the width of a mark on a dial. They are edged out, not overrun. When a record that is held for more than 8 decades is beaten by 3 full degrees in a single afternoon, it stops being a weather event and starts being a signal. It means the thing being measured is not creeping upward, it is moving, and yet the 120 is not the story. The National Weather Service logged it, the wire services carried it, tourists photographed the temperature displays on the Strip, and the whole country spent about a day and a half looking at Las Vegas. Then the news moved on. What almost nobody reported was the number sitting underneath it, in the same dataset, from the same summer. That tells you far more about where this city is actually headed, because the days in Las Vegas are getting hotter. But the nights are getting hotter faster, and it is the nights that kill people. Before any of that makes sense, you have to understand that this city was assembled piece by piece on top of ground that could not support it. And you have to understand how recently that happened. Las Vegas was formally founded in 1905 when a railroad auction sold off parcels of dust beside a new line running between Salt Lake City and Southern California. There was water there in the sense that a handful of artesian springs fed a meadow, which is what the Spanish name refers to. There was not water there in any sense that would support a city. For its first quarter century, Las Vegas was a division point on a railroad and nothing else. The first thing that changed it was not tourism. It was concrete. In 1931, construction began on what would become the Hoover Dam, 30 miles southeast in Black Canyon. The federal government built an entire town, Boulder City, to house the workers. Thousands of men arrived in the middle of the Depression to pour the largest concrete structure the world had yet attempted, and Las Vegas became the place they went on their days off. By 1936, the dam was finished, and behind it sat Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, holding back a river that would now be legally divided among 7 states. That reservoir is the reason everything that follows was possible. It is also, as we will see, one of the mechanisms by which the heat now compounds. In 1940, the census counted roughly 8,000 people in Las Vegas. The following year, the first resort opened on a stretch of highway outside the city limits, on county land where taxes were lower. Others followed. In 1946 came the Flamingo. Through the 1950s, the city grew on a strange combination of legal gambling, quick divorces, and, remarkably, atomic tourism, as visitors gathered on hotel rooftops to watch mushroom clouds rise from the Nevada test site 65 miles to the northwest. The population passed 40,000. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the resorts consolidated and the suburbs began. Air conditioning, which had been a luxury in 1940, became standard in new construction, and that single technological shift is what made year-round residential life in the Mojave commercially viable. You could now sell a house in a place that reached 110 degrees in July, because the house came with a machine that made July survivable. By 1980, the metropolitan area held roughly 460,000 people. Then came the mega resort era. The Mirage opened in 1989 and rewrote the economics of the Strip. Through the 1990s, one enormous property after another went up, each surrounded by parking structures measured in acres, and behind the Strip, in every direction, the valley floor filled in. Master-planned communities marched outward toward the mountains, Summerlin to the west, Henderson and Anthem to the southeast, North Las Vegas pushing toward the Sheep Range. Each development brought roads, driveways, roofs, cul-de-sacs, and the parking that American suburban design requires. By 2000, the metro population had passed 1.3 million. Las Vegas was, for a stretch of that decade, the fastest-growing large metropolitan area in the United States. Today, more than 2.3 million people live in the Las Vegas Valley, and roughly 40 million visitors arrive every year. Now hold those two numbers side by side. 8,000 people in 1940, 2.3 million today. That is a multiplication by more than 280 inside a single long human lifetime in a valley that receives about 4 inches of rain a year. For scale on that rainfall figure, it is less than Phoenix gets, less than a quarter of what falls on Denver, and less than a 20th of what falls on Miami. There is no river running through the valley. There is no natural lake within it. The groundwater beneath it was never remotely sufficient for a population of this size. None of that growth was inevitable. It required the dam, the Colorado River Compact, the interstate highways, cheap land, and an economy built on flying people in from somewhere cooler. And it required paving the desert. Roughly 400 square miles of it. That last part is what nobody planned for, and it is the reason the numbers are now behaving the way they are. Go back to July 2024 and look at the week rather than the day. On Sunday, July 7th, the temperature at Harry Reid hit 118 degrees at 2:33 in the afternoon. 40 minutes later, at 3:13, it hit 119. By 5 o'clock, it had reached 120. The forecasters watching the readouts were, by their own accounts, not entirely certain the instruments were behaving correctly. That day was the hottest in the recorded history of Las Vegas. But it did not stand alone. July 9th reached 119. July 10th reached 118. July 11th reached 118 again. Those 4 days, taken together, are the 4 hottest days ever recorded in this city, and every one of them happened inside a single week. The city then recorded 7 consecutive days at or above 115 degrees. The previous record for that streak was 4 consecutive days, set in July of 2005. 7 is not an incremental improvement on 4. It is close to double it, and buried inside that stretch is a statistic almost nobody has repeated since. 3 consecutive days above 118 degrees. In the entire instrumental record for Las Vegas, which reaches back to 1937, that had never once happened, not in 87 years of continuous measurement spanning a world war. The entire post-war boom, and every previous heat wave the Mojave had ever produced. By the end of that year, Las Vegas had logged 112 days of triple-digit heat. The previous record was 100 days, set in 1947. The month of July alone averaged nearly 100 degrees for its daily high, running almost 7 degrees above what is considered normal. Summer 2024 was, by every metric the National Weather Service tracks, the hottest summer in the history of the city. Hottest average high, hottest average low, hottest overall average temperature. Which brings us to the number that got left out of every broadcast. Across that summer, Las Vegas set or tied 13 daily record high temperatures. Across that same summer, it set or tied 26 daily record warm lows. Twice as many. Not twice as many through some quirk of how records are counted. Twice as many, because the nighttime minimum temperature in this city is climbing faster than the daytime maximum, and has been for years. The following year told the same story from a different angle. In the 12 months leading into January 2026, Las Vegas tied or broke 38 temperature records. 29 of them were nighttime records. 76% of the records this city is now breaking are happening after dark. To understand why that is the genuinely frightening number, and why the 120 is not, you have to understand what heat actually does inside a human body. Not as a metaphor, as mechanics. Your body runs at roughly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it has a narrow tolerance around that figure. Every enzyme you depend on, every protein that folds into a working shape, is calibrated for that temperature. Push the core more than a few degrees above it, and those structures begin to come apart. Because your body is constantly generating heat simply by being alive, it has to shed that heat continuously. It does so through four mechanisms: radiation, where heat leaves the skin as infrared energy; convection, where moving air carries it away; conduction, where it passes into whatever cooler thing you are touching; and evaporation, where sweat absorbs heat as it turns to vapor and carries that energy off with it. Here is the part that matters, and it is the single most important piece of physics in this entire story. Three of those four mechanisms require the air around you to be cooler than your skin. Skin temperature sits at roughly 95 degrees, so when the ambient air temperature rises above 95, radiation, convection, and conduction do not simply become less effective. They reverse. The air stops removing heat from your body and begins delivering heat into it. You are now being actively heated by your surroundings, the way a piece of meat is heated in an oven. At that point, you have exactly one cooling mechanism left: sweat. This is why heat above the mid-90s is categorically different from heat below it, and it is why the Clark County Coroner's Office draws its investigative threshold at 95 degrees. That number is not arbitrary. It is the approximate line at which the human body switches from losing heat to its environment to gaining heat from it. Now, Las Vegas has one genuine physiological advantage, and it deserves stating honestly rather than skipping past. The Mojave is dry. Sweat evaporates efficiently in dry air, which means that final cooling mechanism keeps working here in conditions that would already be lethal somewhere humid. The much-discussed wet bulb limit. The threshold at which humidity prevents evaporation entirely, and even a healthy person sitting in shade with unlimited water will eventually die, is rarely the binding constraint in Las Vegas, the way it can be on the Gulf Coast or in South Asia. But that advantage arrives attached to its own bill. Evaporative cooling costs water. In extreme dry heat, a person can lose 1 to 2 liters of sweat an hour, and unlike in humid conditions, it evaporates so fast that you may never feel wet. People in the Mojave routinely become severely dehydrated without ever registering that they are sweating heavily. And once dehydration sets in, blood volume falls, and the body's capacity to sweat falls with it. The one remaining cooling mechanism begins shutting down precisely when it is needed most. At the same time, the cardiovascular system is under enormous strain. To dump heat, the body dilates the vessels near the skin and pushes blood outward. Cardiac output can nearly double. Heart rate climbs and stays climbed. For a healthy 25-year-old, that is uncomfortable and survivable. For a 70-year-old with existing cardiovascular disease, that sustained demand is the failure point, and it is why an enormous share of heat deaths are recorded on the certificate as cardiac events rather than as heat. The heat is what killed them. The heart is what stopped. If core temperature does reach approximately 104 degrees, the condition is heat stroke, and it is a true medical emergency with a cascade that is very difficult to reverse. Proteins begin to denature, cell membranes lose integrity, the lining of the gut becomes permeable, allowing bacterial toxins into the bloodstream, which triggers a body-wide inflammatory response resembling sepsis. Muscle tissue can break down and release myoglobin, which overwhelms the kidneys. Clotting cascades misfire. Organs fail in sequence. And now, finally, we can say precisely why the nights matter more than the days. The human body does not accumulate heat damage the way a thermometer accumulates degrees. It accumulates it the way a battery discharges. Across a hot day, core temperature drifts upward, the cardiovascular system works harder, you dehydrate, and you build up what physiologists call heat load. For most people that is survivable, for a while, because of what normally happens after sunset. At night, the air cools below skin temperature. Radiation, convection, and conduction switch back on. Your body sheds the accumulated load. Core temperature returns toward baseline, heart rate falls, fluid balance partially restores. You reset. Then you can absorb another hot day. Remove the night, and that entire mechanism fails. When overnight lows remain above roughly 90 degrees, the body never regains its 3 passive cooling channels. The heat load carries into the next morning, and then the next, and it compounds across days. A person who could survive a single afternoon at 1:15 with a cool night afterward may not survive 4 days at 112, with nights that never fall below 92. The peak is not what kills. The absence of recovery is what kills, and Las Vegas is systematically removing its own nights. The mechanism behind that removal is not mysterious, and it is not primarily atmospheric. It is material. Consider what a desert does at night with no city on top of it. Sand, gravel, and creosote scrub have low thermal mass. They absorb solar radiation during the day and release nearly all of it within a few hours of sunset. The sky over the Mojave is dry and clear, so long-wave radiation escapes upward efficiently, straight out to space. This is why the desert has always been a place of extremes. Brutal by day, genuinely cold by night. Travelers have written about that contrast for as long as anyone has crossed this basin. Now pave it. Asphalt is dark, which means it absorbs a very high fraction of the solar energy striking it rather than reflecting it away. It is dense, which means it holds enormous quantities of heat per unit volume. And it is laid thick, which means that heat penetrates well below the surface over the course of a day. A parking lot in Las Vegas in July does not simply get hot. It charges. Layer by layer, hour by hour, it stores thermal energy the way a battery stores charge, and by late afternoon, the pavement surface can exceed 150 degrees. Concrete behaves the same way. So does the structural mass of every building, every block wall, every tile roof, every multi-story parking garage on the Strip. Then the sun goes down, and the process reverses. The pavement is now far hotter than the air above it, so it radiates, all night. Slowly, steadily, out of a reservoir of stored heat too deep to empty in 8 hours of darkness. The air above the city never cools the way air above open desert cools, because the ground beneath it is still delivering yesterday afternoon into tonight. That is the urban heat island. It is not a figure of speech. It is a thermal battery the size of a metropolitan region, charged every day and discharged every night, and it grows measurably every single time another acre of it is poured. The measured effect in Las Vegas is extraordinary. Researchers at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas have found that on clear nights, Harry Reid International Airport averages between 5 and 15 degrees warmer than the surrounding rural desert. During summer, the gap between the city and the untouched land immediately outside it has been measured as high as 24 degrees. 24 degrees. That is not a nuance sitting on top of the regional climate. That is a second climate, manufactured locally, layered directly over the first one. And Las Vegas does not merely possess a heat island. Between 2004 and 2013, climate scientists ranked it as the most intense urban heat island in the United States, on both daytime and nighttime metrics. Not among the most intense. The most intense on both measures in a country that also contains Phoenix, Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta. Stefan Lehman, a professor in the Unilev School of Architecture and director of the university's Urban Futures Lab, has studied this for years, and his framing is worth repeating precisely. Dusk, he points out, is supposed to matter as much as dawn. The hours of darkness are what leverage the daytime high, what keep a hot afternoon from becoming a lethal week. That cooling half of the daily cycle, he says, is not happening as much anymore. We built the thing that removed it. That is the part worth sitting with before we go any further. Nobody imported this. Nobody voted on it. There was no single decision, no meeting, no moment at which a city chose to raise its own overnight temperatures by 15 degrees. It emerged square foot by square foot out of 80 years of entirely ordinary choices about roads and rooftops and where to put the parking. The arithmetic of that construction is simple and unforgiving. Every new subdivision on the edge of the valley converts pale desert soil, which reflects a meaningful share of incoming sunlight, into dark asphalt roads, dark roofs, and concrete driveways, which absorb it. Stephanie McAfee, the Nevada state climatologist, has described the mechanism plainly. Light-colored ground, sand or bare soil or pale concrete, stays cooler than a black asphalt roadway. As a city accumulates darker materials, it absorbs more heat, and it releases that heat at night, producing warmer than usual overnight temperatures. The valley has been doing exactly this, continuously, for 80 years. Every decade of growth has expanded the surface area of the battery. The city did not get hotter because of one bad decision. It got hotter because of several million small ones, each individually reasonable and collectively decisive. There is a study that quantifies the other direction, and it is one of the more hopeful pieces of data in this entire story. In 2024, the United States Geological Survey examined the cooling effect of tree canopy across several hot American cities and found that trees deliver a more powerful cooling effect in Las Vegas than they do in Miami or in Phoenix. The dry air and the intense solar load mean that shade and transpiration do more work here than almost anywhere else in the country. The study went further and put a number on it. If Las Vegas were able to remove roughly 20% of its heat-trapping pavement and replace it with tree canopy, air temperatures across the city could fall by as much as 4 degrees during heat waves. 4 degrees is not a rounding error. 4 degrees is the difference between an overnight low of 92 and an overnight low of 88. 4 degrees is, in physiological terms, the difference between a night that offers no recovery and a night that offers some. Hold that number. We will come back to exactly what it would take. So how much has Las Vegas warmed, and how does that compare against the planet as a whole? Climate Central, an independent organization of scientists that tracks long-term temperature trends across American cities, has been running this analysis for years, and Nevada keeps appearing at the top of it. In its most recent assessment, released around Earth Day in April 2026, the two fastest warming cities in the United States were both in Nevada. Reno had warmed by 7.9 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. Las Vegas had warmed by 6 degrees over the same period. Now set that against the global figure. Global average surface temperature across that same window has risen by roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Las Vegas is warming at approximately 3 times the rate of the planet. And the trajectory inside that number is what makes the phrase faster than expected literally accurate rather than rhetorical. Stephen Lehman has noted that the city has warmed more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 20 years alone. If 6 degrees accumulated since 1970, and half of that arrived in the most recent 2 decades of a 5-decade record, then the warming is not linear. It is accelerating. The curve is bending upward. This is the precise point where the models and the measurements come apart, and it is worth being careful about why, because it is not a story about scientists being wrong. Global climate models are built to simulate the atmosphere and the oceans. They are extraordinarily good at what they were designed to do, which is project how the planet's energy balance responds to greenhouse gas concentrations at scales of hundreds of kilometers. Run at that resolution, the Mojave Desert warms, the Southwest dries, and heat waves lengthen. All of that was projected. All of that has happened. What those models do not resolve is a single metropolitan valley deciding to double its paved surface area every 20 years. The urban heat island is not a climate signal. It is a land use signal. It operates at a scale far below what a global model can see. It is driven by construction rather than by emissions. And it stacks directly on top of the global trend rather than replacing it. McAfee has been direct about the combination, noting that warming is visible outside the cities as well, which points to global change, while the cities themselves are getting warmer than the rural land around them. So the answer to why is it heating faster than expected is not that the physics were wrong. It is that a city built a second heat source underneath the first one, and the two are compounding. That is the mechanism. Here is the cost. In 2023, the Clark County coroner and medical examiner recorded 294 deaths in which heat was a factor. In 2024, the summer of the 120-degree day and the 112 triple-digit days and the 7-day streak above 115, that number was 526. The Southern Nevada Health District, which tracks heat-associated deaths using a slightly narrower definition based on vital records for Clark County residents, counted 513 for the same year and reported it as a 73% increase over the previous year. Alongside those deaths there were 3,548 heat-related emergency department visits. Take a moment on that emergency department figure because it changes the shape of the picture entirely. For every person who died, roughly 7 more arrived at a hospital sick enough from heat to be formally recorded. Heat mortality is the visible tip of a far larger volume of harm, and every one of those 3,548 visits represents a person who came close. The ages of the dead ran from 18 to 91. There is no demographic inside that range. That is everyone. 23% of the heat-associated deaths were people who were not Clark County residents. Visitors, people who flew into a city that receives 40 million tourists a year, walked out of an air-conditioned terminal into 115-degree air, and had no physiological acclimatization whatsoever. Acclimatization is real, and it is protective. Your body genuinely does adapt to sustained heat, increasing blood plasma volume and beginning to sweat earlier and more efficiently, but it takes 1 to 2 weeks of repeated exposure to develop. A tourist arriving on a Friday has none of it. The Clark County Coroner's Office widened its criteria in 2021, and now generally considers heat as a potential contributing factor in deaths occurring above 95 degrees. That widening matters for reading the trend honestly. Some portion of the increase in recorded heat deaths reflects better counting rather than more dying, and anyone presenting this data without saying so is overselling it. Officials are also clear that many of these deaths involve compounding factors: cardiovascular disease, chronic illness, physical exertion, poor hydration, and drug use, with certain substances, including fentanyl and methamphetamine, substantially raising vulnerability by interfering directly with the body's ability to regulate its own temperature. None of that makes the deaths less real. It tells you who dies. It is almost never a healthy, hydrated, housed, acclimatized person sitting indoors. It is someone whose margin was already thin, meeting a night that would not cool down. And the peak, according to the health district, is not July, it is August. Not because August is the hottest month, but because August is when the accumulated load of an entire summer finally exceeds what a compromised body can carry. Which raises the question of where, exactly, in this valley people are dying. And the answer takes you somewhere most visitors to Las Vegas never learn exists. Beneath the Strip, beneath the casinos. Beneath the parking structures and the boulevards, there is a second city. Running under the Las Vegas Valley is a network of storm drains, culverts, and flood control tunnels roughly 600 miles long. Most of it was built in the 1990s in response to the flash flooding that the surrounding mountains funnel into the basin during monsoon season. Rain that falls on bare rock miles away arrives here fast, with nowhere to soak in. And the tunnels exist to move it out from under the city before it takes the streets. Somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 people live down there. That estimate comes from the Shine a Light Foundation, a nonprofit whose outreach workers go into the tunnels regularly, and it is corroborated by street medicine providers and by help of Southern Nevada, whose homeless response teams work the same ground. The figure has been climbing for a decade. Robert Banghart, Shine a Light's outreach director, has described the growth as steady, tracking the growth of the city itself as housing costs rise and affordable units disappear. People down there have built genuine dwellings, plywood partitions, salvaged furniture, shelving, beds raised off the concrete floor. Some have lived in the same stretch of tunnel for years. And here is the reason this belongs in a film about heat rather than in a film about housing. Ask why people go underground, and the first answer, consistently, is temperature. The tunnels are shaded. They are cool in summer and warmer in winter. In a city where the surface of a parking lot can exceed 150 degrees and the overnight low will not drop below the low 90s, a concrete drainage tunnel is one of the few places in the entire valley that stays survivable without electricity. The coolest accessible place in Las Vegas is a storm drain. That is what the urban heat island looks like at ground level. For the people with the least. Not a statistic about albedo. A choice between the surface, which is lethal for a large part of the year, and a tunnel, which is not, except the tunnel is also lethal on a different schedule. The people who live down there describe the warning sign precisely. During heavy monsoon rain, water begins spurting from joints and drain openings inside the tunnel. That is the signal, and the window is measured in minutes. What follows is a fast-moving wall of water carrying debris, shopping carts, boulders, timber, anything the wash has picked up on its way down. Residents describe the sound as a train arriving. Belongings are swept away routinely. People have drowned. And because rain falling on the mountains outside the valley can raise water levels in the tunnels without a single drop landing on the strip, the flood can arrive on a day that looks clear overhead. So the trade is this: stay on the surface and face a summer that killed 526 people in Clark County in 1 year. Go underground and escape the heat. And accept that the thing you are sheltering inside was purpose-built to fill with water without warning. That is the actual choice being made, right now, by around 1,500 people, directly beneath one of the wealthiest entertainment districts on Earth. Above ground, there is another population meeting the heat with no ability to avoid it. The people whose work is outdoors. Construction crews. Roofers, working directly on the darkest, hottest surface in the built environment. Landscapers. Road crews, laying the asphalt that stores the heat. Warehouse and logistics workers in uncooled buildings. Valets, doormen, and ground staff at properties where the guests are indoors and the staff are not. For most of American history, there has been no federal rule protecting any of them. Federal OSHA has no heat illness standard. It proposed a national one in July 2024, and that proposal remains in development. In its absence, individual states have acted on their own timetables, starting with California, which put its outdoor heat illness standard in place back in 2005. Nevada took until 2024. The state's Division of Industrial Relations adopted Regulation R-131-24-APE on November 15, 2024, after what the division's administrator, Victoria Carrion, described as 4 years of discussion with stakeholders. Guidance followed in January 2025, and Nevada OSHA began enforcement on April 29, 2025. The pressure that produced it is visible in the complaint data. Nevada OSHA received 210 heat-related complaints in 2022. In 2023, 300. Through September of 2024 alone, 467, the most in the agency's history. What the regulation requires is worth stating plainly because it is genuine progress. Businesses with more than 10 employees must complete a one-time job hazard analysis covering job classifications where a majority of workers are exposed to heat for more than 30 minutes in any 60-minute period, excluding breaks. Where that analysis identifies a risk, the employer must produce a written safety program that provides drinking water, provides a means of cooling, monitors working conditions, identifies processes that generate additional heat, trains employees, and sets out emergency procedures. That is a real standard where none existed, and it took 4 years to negotiate. Now read the rest break provision carefully because it contains the gap. The written plan must provide a rest break when an employee exhibits signs or symptoms of heat illness. When an employee exhibits signs or symptoms, that is a reactive trigger, not a preventive one. The break is owed once a worker is already showing symptoms of heat illness, rather than being scheduled at defined temperature thresholds to stop symptoms developing in the first place, and by the time heat illness is visible from the outside. The physiological cascade described earlier is already underway. Core temperature is already elevated. Blood volume is already down. In a genuinely dangerous case, the earliest signs include confusion and impaired judgment, which means the standard partly depends on a person recognizing a condition that is actively degrading their ability to recognize anything. The regulation also excludes employees working in climate-controlled environments and applies only to employers with more than 10 staff, which leaves out a meaningful share of the small landscaping and construction outfits where this work actually gets done. None of that makes the rule worthless. It makes it a first version, arriving 19 years after California's, in the fastest warming major city in the country. And there is one more dimension to who absorbs this heat, which is geographic, and it is not subtle. The heat is not distributed evenly across the Las Vegas Valley. It is not close to evenly distributed. Research by American Forests examining tree canopy across American cities found that in Las Vegas, neighborhoods where a majority of residents are people of color have on average 33% less tree canopy than majority white neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where 90% or more of residents live in poverty have 41% less canopy than neighborhoods where only 10% or fewer do. A 2024 study measured what that gap does to the air itself. Neighborhoods with poor canopy in this valley can run up to 9 degrees hotter than parts of the valley with better tree cover and more green space. 9 degrees. Inside the same city, on the same afternoon. Determined in large part by which streets got planted decades ago and which ones did not. Consider East Las Vegas, where the deficit is most severe. Based on census data, over 27% of residents identify as Latino and another 10% as Asian American. Median household income is around $32,000 a year. Roughly 67% of residents rent rather than own. Every one of those facts compounds the exposure, and they compound in ways that are worth spelling out. A renter cannot plant a tree on property that is not theirs. A renter frequently cannot replace a failing air conditioning unit, add insulation, or install a reflective roof, because none of it belongs to them, and a landlord facing that expense has limited incentive in a market where the unit will rent regardless. A household living on $32,000 a year faces a summer electricity bill that competes directly with food, medication, and rent. Public health researchers have documented what happens next, and it is the quiet part of this crisis. People skip doctor's appointments and go without prescriptions in order to keep paying for cooling. The heat starts extracting its cost months before it puts anyone in an ambulance, and it extracts that cost in exactly the chronic conditions, cardiovascular disease above all, that turn a hot week into a fatal one. Dan Leffel, who has analyzed heat-related hospitalizations in southern Nevada, has described the east and northeast of the city in blunt terms, calling them death traps, and arguing that Nevada cannot establish a dedicated statewide heat office soon enough. To close the canopy gap fully across the region, by the standard researchers call tree equity. Southern Nevada would need to plant more than 560,000 trees. Remember that number too. We are about to find out how many the city has actually managed. Now, here is the complication, and it is the part that makes this story harder and more interesting than a straight line pointing upward. 2025 was better, substantially better. Deaths in Clark County, where heat was a factor, fell to somewhere between 284 and 298, depending on which agency's definition you use, against 513 to 527 the year before. The Southern Nevada Health District recorded it as a 45% decline. Summer 2025 was noticeably milder than the record-shattering summer that preceded it. The valley logged 104 days above the coroner's 95-degree threshold rather than the punishing stretch of 2024. If you wanted to argue that 2024 was a freak event and that the alarm was overdone, 2025 is the year you would point to. And you would not be arguing in bad faith. The numbers moved in the right direction, sharply, in a single year. Except that when you look closely at 2025, it does not say what it appears to say. According to the National Weather Service, 2025 was still the 5th warmest year on record for Las Vegas. It still logged 77 days at or above 100 degrees. And there is one detail in the 2025 record that is more revealing than anything in 2024. The last day Las Vegas reached 110 degrees in 2025 was August 21st. That is the latest date in the entire historical record on which this city has ever hit 110. Sit with what that means. In a year everybody experienced as a reprieve, in a year when the peak was lower and the death toll halved, the hot season nonetheless extended further into the calendar than it ever had before. The intensity dropped. The duration did not. That is the signature of a shifting baseline rather than a shifting peak, and it is a far harder problem because peaks are events and baselines are conditions. A city can survive an event. A city has to be rebuilt for a condition. Then, 2026 arrived and removed any remaining ambiguity. Through March 15th, the average temperature for the year to date in Las Vegas was 57.6 degrees, the highest figure on record for that point in the calendar. The warmest start to a year this city has ever measured, arriving in the season that is supposed to be the recovery. The pattern across 3 years is not a spike. It is a floor rising. So what is being done about it, and is it enough? The honest answer to the second half is not yet and not close, but the direction is finally right. The city of Las Vegas launched a tree initiative with a target of planting roughly 60,000 additional trees. Clark County has run a community canopy project, distributing free trees to residents of the zip codes identified as most heat vulnerable, prioritizing the east side and downtown, where eligible households can receive 2 rather than 1. The demand tells you something on its own. When the county released its first batch, 2,200 trees were claimed in 72 hours. Bradley Daisler, the urban forester for the city of Las Vegas, has explained that the target zip codes were not selected arbitrarily. Planners combined census data, temperature records, and a canopy study built from aerial imagery to identify precisely where shade is scarcest and the heat island is worst. That is genuinely good policy. It is targeted, it is evidence-based, and it directs scarce resources at the neighborhoods carrying the heaviest load rather than the ones that complain loudest. Now set it against the scale of the problem. The city's goal is 60,000 trees. As of spring 2025, roughly 2,500 had been planted. The county program has distributed several thousand more, with a target of another 4,500 through spring 2026. Meanwhile, the regional shortfall required to reach tree equity is more than 560,000. At the observed rate, the gap does not close this century. And there is a constraint sitting underneath the tree programs that nobody can engineer around, which is that trees in the Mojave require water, and water is the other half of this crisis. Every acre of canopy the valley plants is an acre that must be irrigated out of a Colorado River allocation the region is already fighting to hold. The cooling solution and the water shortage draw on the same account. There has also been movement on the legal side. In 2025, the Nevada legislature passed a bill requiring the state's largest cities and counties, including Clark County and the cities of Las Vegas, Henderson, and North Las Vegas, to produce formal heat mitigation plans. It was signed into law and took effect on the 1st of July. The requirements include expanding access to public drinking water, expanding access to cooling centers, and encouraging cool building practices, built shade, and tree canopy. This is the first time Nevada has legally required its jurisdictions to plan for heat as a systemic hazard rather than respond to it as a seasonal inconvenience. That matters, and it should be said clearly. Advocates who worked on the bill have been equally clear about its limitation, which is that the law creates obligations without attaching the funding to meet them. A plan is not a canopy. A requirement to encourage shade does not pour shade onto a street. And Assemblymember Cynthia Moore of North Las Vegas has signaled an intention to go further in the 2027 session. Exploring legislation to create a dedicated state heat office of the kind Dan Leffel has been calling for. Clark County continues to activate cooling stations at community centers, libraries, and public buildings during extreme heat events, and those stations save lives. They also depend on a person being able to reach one during opening hours, on foot or by bus, across a valley designed around the car, which excludes a meaningful share of exactly the population most at risk, and excludes almost everyone living in the tunnels. And then there is the part of the ledger running in the opposite direction. Every strategy described so far assumes the city is subtracting heat from the valley. Something else is being added. Las Vegas runs on air conditioning, not as a comfort, as life support. On an afternoon in the 110s, an unconditioned interior in this valley becomes lethal within hours, and every one of the 2.3 million people in this metropolitan area depends on a compressor somewhere continuing to run. That produces a structural vulnerability with no equivalent in a temperate city. And it has a physical property most people never think about. Air conditioning does not destroy heat, it moves it. Every unit in the valley extracts heat from an interior and rejects it into the outdoor air, along with the waste heat of the electricity used to run the compressor, which means the collective act of a city cooling itself makes the air outside that city measurably hotter, which increases demand, which rejects more heat. It is a feedback loop, and it runs hardest at precisely the hours when the grid is under maximum strain. Studies in other hot cities have found that waste heat from air conditioning can add roughly 1 to 2 degrees to urban nighttime temperatures during heat waves, concentrated in exactly the overnight window where recovery is supposed to happen. The city cools its interiors by heating its nights. Now add the newest variable. In June 2026, Las Vegas approved a significant data center expansion, with officials openly discussing whether future regulation will be needed. Data centers are, in thermodynamic terms, buildings that convert electricity into heat at close to a 1-to-1 ratio and then reject that heat into the surrounding environment. They also require enormous, continuous, non-negotiable power, and many cooling designs consume substantial water on top of it, citing them in the most intense urban heat island in the United States. In a valley where peak electrical demand already coincides with peak temperature is a decision whose consequences will be measured in the overnight lows of the 2030s. The compounding risk is easy to state and difficult to overstate. A grid failure in Las Vegas during a January cold snap is an inconvenience. A grid failure in Las Vegas during a July afternoon at 118 degrees in a city where the overnight low will not fall below 92 is a mass casualty event on a timescale of hours. Interior temperatures in an unpowered apartment in this valley climb fast, and the people least able to evacuate are the same people already carrying the highest chronic disease burden. The thing standing between those two scenarios is a distribution network operating at its absolute maximum for consecutive days in the worst ambient conditions it will ever face. If you want to know what the next stage looks like, you do not have to model it. You can drive to it. Phoenix is 300 miles southeast in the Sonoran Desert, and it is the same experiment running slightly ahead. In 2024, Phoenix recorded 113 consecutive days at or above 100 degrees. The previous record was 76 days, set in 1993. It is worth pausing on the size of that jump, because it is the Phoenix equivalent of a 3-degree record break. A streak record did not creep upward by a few days. It was beaten by more than a month. That same year, Phoenix logged 70 days above 110 degrees against a long-term average of about 21. Phoenix has responded more aggressively than Las Vegas has, and that is the useful part. The city has run one of the largest cool pavement programs in the country, applying reflective sealant across residential streets to reduce how much solar energy the asphalt absorbs in the first place. It has expanded its urban tree and shade program with a target of covering a quarter of the city with shade by 2030. It established a publicly funded office dedicated specifically to heat response, years before Nevada began debating whether to create one. And Phoenix is still setting records. That is the honest lesson from 300 miles southeast, and it cuts both ways. Aggressive intervention is not sufficient on its own to stop the trend. It is also almost certainly the reason the death toll is not far worse. Those are not contradictory findings. They are what adaptation actually looks like, not a solution, a reduction in the rate of loss. There is one more system in this story, and it is the one that connects the heat back to whether the city can exist at all. Water. Las Vegas draws roughly 90% of its supply from Lake Mead, fed by the Colorado River, fed in turn by snowpack in the Rocky Mountains. And snowpack is not simply precipitation, it is storage. Snow accumulates through the winter and releases slowly through spring and early summer, metering water into the river across months, in exactly the pattern that every reservoir and irrigation system in the basin was designed around. Rain does not do that. Rain runs off immediately. Scientists at the Southern Nevada Water Authority estimate that winter precipitation in the basin now yields between 5 and 15% more rain and correspondingly less snow than it did just a few decades ago. That is the same warming, expressed as a different crisis. The Southwest is not necessarily receiving dramatically less water from the sky. It is increasingly receiving it in a form that cannot be stored, arriving faster, running off sooner, and evaporating more readily from warmer reservoir surfaces on the way. Heat and drought in this region are not two problems that happen to coincide. They are one problem observed at 2 points in the same system. The heat killing people in a Las Vegas August is the same heat converting the snowpack into premature runoff in a Colorado March. In mid-2022, Lake Mead fell to just over 26% of capacity, the lowest level since the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s. An exceptional snow year in 2023 raised it more than 20 feet and forced federal water managers to tear up their projections. It did not repair the underlying arithmetic. Scientists said so at the time, and the phrasing was blunt. One exceptional snow year does not rewrite 2 decades of overuse. 40 million people across 7 states depend on that river. And the 1922 Colorado River Compact, the century-old agreement dividing it based on flow measurements taken during some of the wettest decades on record, is being renegotiated now against a 2026 deadline. How Arizona, California, Nevada, and the other basin states divide a shrinking river will determine whether the fastest warming major city in America has the water to keep cooling itself, to keep irrigating the canopy that is supposed to cool it further, and to keep supplying the industries it is currently approving. So where does this end? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and anyone offering you a specific year and a specific temperature is selling a certainty that does not exist. But some things can be said with confidence. The 120-degree reading from July 2024 will be broken. Not necessarily next summer, possibly not for a decade, but the distribution of possible summers has shifted. And a distribution that produced 120 once will produce it again and eventually exceed it. Long-range projections suggest Las Vegas can expect roughly an additional month of 100-degree days each year by mid-century. But the more consequential threshold is not 125 in the afternoon. It is the overnight low that no longer falls below 95, sustained across a week. That is the condition under which the physiological recovery mechanism described earlier fails for a large fraction of the population simultaneously, rather than for the most vulnerable individually. It is the condition where the emergency departments receive not 3,548 people across a summer, but a comparable number across a weekend. Given a nighttime warming rate outpacing the daytime rate, and a paved surface area that continues to expand, that condition is arriving on a schedule this city has not yet planned for. What would actually change the trajectory is not mysterious. The USGs put a number on it. Convert 20% of the valley's heat absorbing pavement to canopy, and you take 4 degrees off a heat wave. That is a real, measured, achievable intervention, and 4 degrees is precisely the margin that matters. It would also require planting more than 500,000 trees in a desert. On private land, the city cannot compel, using water the region is already fighting to secure, at a rate roughly 2 orders of magnitude faster than the current one. That is the actual shape of the choice. Not whether the science is right, not whether the heat is coming, whether a city that built a 24-degree thermal anomaly in 80 years is capable of dismantling part of it in 20. 3 questions hang over the valley tonight. Why is a city that has warmed 6 degrees since 1970 still expanding its paved surface area every single year? What happens to the neighborhoods in the east and northeast with 41% less canopy and a median household income of $32,000 on the first week when the overnight low does not fall below 95? And what does it mean that the fastest warming major city in the United States has just approved a new generation of buildings whose primary physical output is heat? Right now, out at Harry Reid International Airport, in a small louvered white enclosure mounted above a patch of ground east of the runways, there is a temperature sensor. It is unremarkable. It is the same instrument in the same location, doing the same job once every hour, that recorded 117 degrees in 1942 and 120 degrees in 2024. It has no opinion about any of this. It reports. It is dark out there now. The sun went down hours ago. Across the valley, underneath the sensor and the runways and the interstates and the parking structures and 400 square miles of subdivision, the asphalt laid down this decade and the decade before and the decade before that is still warm. It will still be warm at 3 in the morning. It is releasing this afternoon into tonight, the way it does every night, the way it will again tomorrow. 600 miles of drainage tunnel run beneath it, and somewhere in them, about 1,500 people are sheltering from a heat that has not left the surface